Welcome back. Shri Matre Namaha. So let's begin with our opening mantras. Namo Devyai Mahadevyai Shivayai Satatam Namaha Nama Prakrityai Bhadrayai Niyatah Pranatasmatam Om Jayanti Mangala Kali Bhadrakali Kapalini Durga Kshama Shiva Dhatri Swaha Swadha Namostute Om Sarvamangala Mangalye Shive Sarvartha Sadhike Sharanye Trayambake Devi Narayani Namostute. So here we are now. We are past the midpoint of the Dasha Mahavidya. And now as we will see actually in this class and in the next class, this is when our sadhana begins to turn. It begins to actually, when we come to Chinnamasta, our sadhana actually takes on a very different kind of a flavor. And especially if we have been studying the Mahavidyas sequentially like we have been. Now, at this point, I want to make a comment. So, although, we are looking at all the 10 Mahavidyas during this 12-week course, I want to really make sure that all of you understand that the sadhana of a single Mahavidya can last lifetimes, not years, not decades, and certainly not weeks or days or months. So to really grok and to really obtain the grace of one of these Mahavidyas takes intense sadhana. It takes intense practice. It takes intense commitment for years and years and years. So we are basically, compressing all of this over a 12-week course, and it's very powerful. I'm sure that all of us involved in this sangha that we have here are going through a lot of changes as a result of delving deep into these very powerful goddesses and learning how they manifest in us and in creation. But this is not an accelerated sadhana. The sadhana, in fact, any sadhana is something that takes time, and the effects that we see come gradually over years of practice. Whether it's meditation, or it's mantra sadhana, or it is self-inquiry, or any other kind of sadhana, it takes time. So, the stories we hear of certain people having sudden and permanent transformations, they're extremely rare. And they should not be our ideal, because that is not the norm. Realization or self-realization for most of us, 99.99% of us, is going to be gradual. And we have to be patient. So if there's one thing that sadhana teaches us, it's patience. So we may feel like there are a lot of things going on, a lot of openings, and we're having all these transformative kind of insights and so on. And generally what happens is that we have a phase of this accelerated growth, and then it plateaus off for a while. And then you feel like, I'm not really making much progress. There's nothing much going on with me. And then suddenly, for no apparent reason, there will be another phase of growth and of purification and of difficulties and obstacles and whatnot, where it is during those times of purification and obstacles that the accelerated growth happens. And then we go off into another plateau. So if you look at the curve, it's basically a plateau, and then you go up slightly, then there is another plateau, then a little bit more, and then there's another plateau, and so on. So, and that goes on for decades. So I just want to reiterate that although we seem to be going very rapidly here, the sadhana of each Mahavidya is intense and prolonged and can last several lifetimes, especially a goddess like Chinnamasta. So Chinnamasta, as you probably already know, she is the self-beheading goddess. And she can appear so fierce and so repulsive that we start to wonder, how and why is she a Mahavidya? What is this whole significance of this? So to examine that, let's first look at her origins in the Tantras. And so in a couple of the Tantras, there is a story of Shiva and Parvati. So Parvati has two friends, or two close, girlfriends that hang out with her and serve her all the time. And they are called Jaya and Vijaya. So Jaya and Vijaya in other Puranas, such as the Bhagavata Purana, which is the Purana of Lord Vishnu, Jaya and Vijaya are actually his gatekeepers. And so there is a story that once they are guarding, Vishnu's abode, Vaikuntha, and one of the most esteemed sages comes to see Vishnu, Lord Vishnu. And Jaya and Vijaya basically say, sorry, you're not allowed. And so these sages, who actually, there are four of these sages that come to visit Lord Vishnu, and they are the sons of Brahma. So Brahma, the creator, remember, he originally creates four sons out of his mind. And they are born enlightened, and they are born with all the supernatural powers or siddhis. So as a result, they always appear young, even though they are ancient in age. So these brothers, they go to Vishnu's abode once, and they are stopped by these gatekeepers, or dwarapalakas, as they are called. So they get really angry, and they curse them both and say, well, because you are disrespecting us, you have to be born in the world of men. You have to take births on earth. And so at that moment, Lord Vishnu appears there to see what all this commotion is about. And, Jaya and Vijaya actually fall at his feet and say, please, Lord, don't let this happen, because we can't bear to be apart from you. So Lord Vishnu says, well, I can't really undo somebody else's curse, but here's the thing. I can make it easier for you. So you can take 7 births on earth and be my friend in each of my births, my avatars on earth, or you can take 3 births as my enemy, and I will be the one to destroy you in those 3 births. So Jaya and Vijaya, they take the option of the 3 births because they can't bear to be away from Lord Vishnu for 7 whole births. So then they actually appear in 3 of these avatars of Lord Vishnu. So in his avatar as the boar, Hiranyaksha is Jaya, and then in his avatar as Narasimha, Hiranyakashipu is Vijaya, and or the other way around. And in another yuga, they become Ravana and Vibhishana in the Ramayana, when Rama is the Lord Rama is the avatar. And in Krishna avatar, actually, they take the form of 2 of Krishna's enemies, the most famous of whom is Shishupala. So in each of these 3 births, they are destroyed by Lord Vishnu, and they come back and they regain their positions as his gatekeepers. So the same Jaya and Vijaya, who were male gatekeepers of Lord Vishnu, they are given these female forms as Parvati's friends in a couple of the tantras. And so once what happens in one of these tantras is um, the reference to Jaya and Vijaya comes when Parvati is newly married to Lord Shiva, and she is looking at Nandi, the bull, who is Lord Shiva's, devotee and mount. So Nandi is Lord Shiva's vehicle, so to speak. And so Parvati loves Nandi and she loves all of Shiva's ganas. They're called ganas, or his army of, and everybody who's on the edges of society, ghosts and discarded kind of people, become Shiva's ganas, so to speak. They are all part of his army. And Parvati loves them all because she loves Shiva. So once she is looking at Nandi with admiration for his surrender and devotion to Shiva, and these 2 friends, Jaya and Vijaya, they plant a seed of doubt in her mind. And they say, Parvati, why are you so happy? And she says, no, look at how devoted Nandi is to Lord Shiva. And I know that as a result of being Shiva's wife, they are equally devoted to me. And they say, are you sure about that? And she says, yeah. And then immediately she says, okay, I'm going to put this to test. And then she says to Nandi, well, I'm going inside into my apartment. I'm going to take a bath right now. Make sure nobody enters. And he says, of course, yeah, I'll do anything. So he's standing guard at the door. And after a while, who comes to the door but Shiva himself? And he says, Nandi doesn't even question. So when he sees Shiva, he forgets the promise he made to Parvati. Shiva strides in, and Parvati is shocked. She's like, how did you get in? And Shiva says, well, Nandi let me in. And she says, he's not supposed to let you in. And Shiva laughs at her and says, what do you mean? He is devoted to me. He's going to do whatever I ask him to do. So Parvati's, doubt is strengthened, and she says, okay, then, in that case, I'm going to create my own son. So out of her own body, she creates a son, this beautiful, beautiful boy, and she gives him this task and says, okay, you stand at the door. And she has this immense love for this boy, and this boy has an immense love for her. And she says, stand at the door and make sure nobody comes in. And he says, yes, mother, whatever you say. So he's standing at the door, and then Shiva comes again. And he says, nothing doing. Sorry, nobody is allowed. And so this story actually gets prolonged, and all of Shiva's ganas are defeated by this boy who's really skilled in warfare. And eventually, Brahma and Vishnu also come down to convince this boy to let Shiva inside the apartment, and he says no. Eventually, Shiva comes down with his trident and he beheads this boy. And so when Parvati hears of this, she is beside herself. And out of her body, all these thousands of Shaktis come out, ready to take on the world and destroy it in this rage for having killed her son. So at that moment, actually, Shiva realizes that this isn't a good idea. So he apologizes to Parvati and says, how can I set this right? And she says, bring my son back to life. So Shiva sends one of his messengers and says, go in the north direction and find the head of the first living thing that you see, and bring it back. And so they head north, and they find that they find a newly fallen elephant. So this elephant has just died. So they bring the head of that elephant, and Shiva actually brings this boy to life with the head of an elephant. And Parvati says, no, this isn't enough. So I want my son to be recognized among the greatest of the greatest deities. And so Shiva blesses him, and he says he will be. In fact, no puja, no ritual, no sadhana will ever begin without first invoking him. And he will be the leader of all the ganas. And thus, Ganesha is born, or Ganapati. So Ganesha literally means Isha is the ruler, and and so he's the ruler over the Ganas. So there is another story in the Tantras that describes Parvati, going to a river to bathe with these two attendants, Jaya and Vijaya. And they also have other names in this particular story. So instead of, they are called Jaya and Vijaya, but they are also called Varnini and Dakini. And so she is at this river. Notice this theme about bathing here. So they are at this river, and it just, the time goes on because they are having such a good time, enjoying the water and so on. And these two companions start complaining to Parvati, and they say, we're hungry, can you feed us? And she keeps putting them off and saying, yeah, just wait, we're going to go back. And they keep complaining, like little kids, but I'm hungry, can you give me something now? And Parvati looks around and says, well, there isn't anything here. And so they say, well, you are the mother of the universe, how are you not going to feed us? And so at that moment, her compassion is so great that she says, fine, I'll feed you. And she beheads herself and feeds these two companions with her own blood that's spurting from her neck. And one of these streams actually goes to her own mouth, that, the head of that she's holding in her hand, her own head. And so in that story, she comes to be known as Chinnamasta. So what is the significance of decapitation with respect to the goddess? What is with all these gory stories? First, there's Ganesha, and then there is Chinnamasta. So in these traditions, the head is actually the most valuable part of a person's body, because it is the site of one's intelligence, and it is where the sense of self is located. And so if you look at various other kinds of societies and cultures, there is the scalping, or there are those kinds of rituals for the same kinds of reasons. And in Tantra, actually, self decapitation is like the highest form of devotion that one can show to the goddess. So there are certain temples, there are descriptions of certain temples. I don't think this actually happens anymore, but there are descriptions of certain temples um, of the goddess where the devotee would go in and basically out of this joy and love coming out of them for the goddess, they just cut off their heads. And there is a story of actually one particular temple which is called Jwalamukhi Temple in this part of India known as Himachal Pradesh. And so there is the story of this man called Dhyanu, and he is a huge devotee of that goddess. And this is during the time of King Akbar, one of the Mughal kings in India. And so Akbar actually is a very tolerant Mughal leader. He was the most tolerant of all the Mughal leaders, emperors. So he hears of, this Dhyanu's bhakti and devotion. And he says, well, let's see if your goddess is going to appear before you. And Dhyanu is so confident that the goddess will appear that he says, okay, fine, whatever. So Akbar locks him up inside the temple, and he takes Dhyanu's horse and outside, and he says, well, if your goddess doesn't appear now, I'm going to have this horse killed. So Dhyanu's praying fervently in front of the goddess and says, please, 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 please appear so my horse is saved. And she doesn't appear. So the horse is killed. And so Akbar starts making fun of him and says, so where is your goddess? So Dhyanu actually then comes down to the goddess and says, well, mother, if you don't show yourself, then there is no chance that you will ever show yourself. So here is my head. So he pulls out his sword and he's about to cut his head off when she actually appears in that temple. And so she brings the horse back to life and so on. So there are all these stories associated with the goddess and the whole issue of self-decapitation. But also the issue of decapitation brings up all kinds of revolt in us, right? We hate to see or think of these kinds of things because this idea of decapitation, whether self or not, it it's actually outside the norms of what is considered normal, right? So especially in terms of devotion or as a sadhana, it is completely outside. It's not the norm, it's not the usual. And as you have seen with all the Mahavidyas, all of these Mahavidyas actually question our moral and cultural and social kinds of norms. And this is precisely, this kind of revolt is precisely what a Tantrika wants to transcend and to go outside of the norms of society. So, this is the other reason that we have amongst the Mahavidyas this great goddess who certainly lies outside of the norms of what is considered normal in terms of bhakti, in terms of practice, and in terms of, what the goddess is even supposed to look like. So at this point, then, let's meditate on this great goddess Chinnamasta. So if you have this mantra, you can pull it out. And close your eyes. Make sure that you are sitting straight. Chinnamasta Mahavidya Mahabhima Mahodari Chandeshwari Chandamata Chandamunda Prabhanjini Mahachanda Chandarupa Chandika Chandakhandini Krodhini Krodhajanani Krodharupa Kuhukala. Salutations to Chinnamasta, the one with the severed head, the Mahavidya, the strongest, the one with the great belly, the terrible goddess and mother, the destroyer of the demons Chanda and Munda. Salutations to her who is the wrathful one, the source and form of wrath, and the form of the new moon. Meditate now on Chinnamasta. Her skin is brilliant. Visualize her shining. And it's so brilliant that you can barely see her garland of human skulls. A snake makes its way up her body, and she's completely naked. She needs only 2 arms. In one, she holds a sword that's dripping blood. And in the other hand, she holds her own head. Her face that she's holding in her hand is radiant, beautiful, ecstatic, with long flowing hair. And even the hair is brilliant, shining bright. And from her neck, there are 3 streams of blood spurting. One of these streams is going to the mouth of the head that she's holding in her hand, her own. And the other 2 are going directly into the mouths of her 2 attendants. That's Varnini and Dakini. And they are ecstatic, being fed by the blood of this great goddess. And this little party of 3 is standing on a couple. Kamadeva is lying on his back, and his wife Rati is on top of him. And they are in sexual union, while Chinnamasta and her two attendants are standing firmly on them. Let's pay homage to this great mother. Bow to her in your mind's eye. The only way to get her grace is to surrender to her completely. Put your head down at her feet and ask her to behead you. Shri Matre Namaha. Take a deep breath and return to your body. And open your eyes. So, when we were talking about Bhuvaneshwari, we talked about the limitation of this primordial light called prakasha into the space in which all of creation occurs, which is akasha. And then in when we were talking about Tara, we talked about how sound, or the primordial sound, is the other precursor of creation. So there is prakasha or light, and then there is sound or nada, which are the precursors of creation. Prakasha becoming limited as akasha or space is Bhuvaneshwari, and becoming limited as time is Kali. But the prakasha is still involved in all of creation. And even though it is there in all of creation, it still transcends it. And this principle of immanence as well as transcendence is Lalita Tripura Sundari. The nada, the unexpressed nada or sound that becomes concentrated into creation is Tripura Bhairavi, as we saw last class. And the sound that is perceiving itself is Tara. But the interaction of light and sound to precipitate creation is Chinnamasta. So as we have seen in both Tripura Sundari and Tripura Bhairavi's classes, creation manifests in triples, in triads. And the divine's triple nature, as we have seen before, is Sat Chit Ananda, or eternal consciousness bliss, or eternal bliss consciousness, which then becomes all the other triads of creation. So the movement of creation from this higher triad to the lower ones is extremely forceful, and it's instantaneous. It's like lightning. In a forceful flash of light and sound, the divine, it's seemingly beheads itself, and creation forgets its true nature. You, me, the world, the universe. So the whole purpose of creation is that the one, the divine, wants to experience itself as many. And the many have to be cut off from the one for that experience to be complete. And all the many have to have their own separate existences, so to speak. So this is like the umbilical cord that's being cut off from the, that basically needs to be cut off so that the child can have its own separate existence. So the interaction of light and sound, this is extremely violent. So Chinnamasta is like the combination of thunder and lightning. And so once this happens, once this separation happens, this forceful separation happens between the divine and its creation, then manifestation basically, creation just gets propelled by its own cycles of what? Will, knowledge, and action. So one thing leads to another, to another, to another, and we get propelled through all of these cycles. So whether it's the, the planets and the galaxies taking birth and evolving and dying out, or our own selves, taking birth and then developing our own stories and I self and eventually dying, it's the same. So the divine basically is forgotten in all of this this propelling force of our own cycles of will, knowledge, and action. But the divine has 5 functions. So we have seen 3 of those. There is creation, there is maintenance or sustaining, and there is destroying. But the other 2 functions are concealing and revealing. And then we saw this actually in the class on Tripura Sundari, where Sundari is actually sitting on this throne that has these 5 functions. So the this power of concealment of the divine, as well as the power of revealing, both of these powers are Chinnamasta. And so we think, so what is the purpose of the concealing and the revealing, right? Only through this power of concealing can the divine experience itself as form. That's when the fun happens. So if the actor didn't temporarily forget his or her actual identity and took on the actor's identity, then the movie or the play would actually not be so interesting, right? It's because they are able to forget who they are for the duration of that play or the movie, that's when it becomes fun. So same thing here. So um, creation forgets its divine origin so that the drama is more interesting. And then um, you know the ironic thing about this is all of us, as we have seen before, every single being, everything in creation is looking for the divine. Each of us, whether we know that or not, whether we are conscious or not, everything that we are hankering after, ultimately, if you distill it down, we want to find that oneness, that completeness, because we are driven by that sense of lack. But what is so ironic about this is that it comes from forgetting that we are already divine. And this is Chinnamasta's great power of concealment. So on the other hand, this the revealing power is like you know like like the prize or the award. So now you make this, it makes the whole game, this whole drama worthwhile, because you forget and then you wake up and you find yourself again, and there's delight and wonder in that. So it's like looking in the mirror if you've never looked in a mirror before, and being fascinated with that. So Chinnamasta's self beheading actually speaks about both the concealing and the revealing powers of the divine. So, how does this happen? So, when we are in utero, it is said that at a particular time, the divine or the Atman descends into our bodies through this topmost part of our head called Brahmarandra. And the energy courses through all the nadis that we have been talking about, these channels of energy. This energy basically facilitates the functioning of all the cells and organs, as well as our minds and our emotions and our intellect. Once this energy descends all the way down, and this it descends through the sushumna to the base of the spine, this brahmarandra closes off, right? So this basically, this the soft part of the head, it closes off, and we forget our true nature, and we become identified as the I self, and Chinnamasta's beheading, that initial beheading, is complete. So Chinnamasta is actually that sushumna, the sushumna nadi, that central channel that we have been talking about, which runs along the spine. And her attendants, Varnini and Dakini, are the Ida and the Pingala. So the Sushumna, Ida, and Pingala are the three most important nadis in the body. So the Ida and Pingala channels, the cold and the hot channels, basically are very representative of how we kind of live in the world of duality. We keep vacillating between liking this, not liking this, wanting this, not wanting this, in that kind of confused nature. And so the the energy that drives all of our body functions fluctuates between the Ida and the Pingala, and very little of it actually goes to the Sushumna. And the Ida and Pingala have opposing functions. So we become very enchanted with the story of the me, the I self, because of these dualistic tendencies of the mind, and because this energy is being dissipated into these two channels instead of going up the Sushumna. So, this Chinnamasta is also known as the Shakti of Virochana. So she's also called Virochanai. So Virochana literally means the luminous, and Virochana is the supreme Lord, which is that prakasha, that primordial light. And so she is the Shakti of that primordial light. And this Virochana, this Lord, this primordial light, if we can personify this deity, he wields a weapon known as the Vajra, or the thunderbolt. So in the Vedas, this Vajra bearing supreme one is called Indra. So remember how, in the last class, we discussed the primacy of the nature deities in the earliest Vedas. So, for instance, Vishnu and Shiva are really not as revered as Agni, as we saw in the last class, and Bhairavi is Agni's Shakti. And so it's the same thing with Indra. Indra, in fact, is the supreme lord in the earliest of the Vedas. In the Puranas, he gets downgraded as the subordinate of Shiva and Vishnu. But for the seers and the sages of the Vedas, Indra is the highest. And he rules over all these triads of existence. And basically, he is that substance of the divine mind. And Chinnamasta is his Shakti. She rules over that divine mind and acts through our minds as the sense behind the senses. So we all know about the five senses of knowledge and the five senses of action. And the mind is often included as another sense. And it's known as the antakarana, or the inner instrument through which the eyes see, the ears hear, and and so on. So the Sanskrit word for sense is indriya, which comes from Indra. So Indriya is the terrain, or the kingdom of Indra, of Lord Indra. And as the Shakti of the Indriyas, or the sense organs, Chinnamasta is called Indrani. And so in her iconography, Chinnamasta is standing on Kamadeva, and Rati, right? And they are basically lost in this union, in the sexual union. Why? Because in this symbolism, the most powerful activity of the senses actually occurs in the sexual act. So Kamadeva is the god of love, as you know we have discussed before, and he plays a very important role in creation by inducing desire. And as we have seen, earlier, desire is the lifeblood of the I self. And Rati, his wife, is the goddess of delight in both physical and sensual pleasure. So together, Kamadeva and Rati, they actually personify the procreative nature of desire, which causes the I self to be born again and again and again in every moment. So when in our sadhana, when we learn to abide, when we learn to stand as the self, then our deeply hidden vasanas start coming up from the subtle and the causal bodies in the form of impulses that pertain to the indriyas, the sense organs. So, for instance, um, if you've ever been a smoker, this might be familiar, where a lot of smokers give up smoking physically, it's gone. However, they can't stop thinking about it. And once that external, once that gross kind of thinking goes away, then they're dreaming about it. At night, they have dreams about that. And when that goes away, this urge to smoke comes up in all kinds of situations that previously led them to smoke, right? In fact, there is a very well-known verse in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that talks about this, that we may think that we have given up something, but actually it just only has gone away from the gross level, and it gets embedded in the subtle and the causal bodies, and these need to be driven out, and that takes time. So um, the mind that registers our sense organ perceptions, it continues to bring up these long ingrained and habit enforced kinds of reactions and impulses. So of all the sense driven impulses, the sexual impulse is the strongest in all sentient beings. So whether it is procreative or it's perverted, it doesn't matter. But this sexual impulse is actually the most difficult to control, even after prolonged sadhana. So even when the impulse no longer arises in the conscious mind, it can continue to arise in the subtle and the causal bodies. So that, people are having dreams about it or having other kinds of issues with it. And this procreative energy is the most potent, of it. It has to be, because that is how life is sustained. And in its ordinary impulse and release, it is basically not really doing much to enable us on the path of sadhana. But when we cultivate and direct this energy to go upward through the sushumna by the grace of Chinnamasta, then this procreative impulse loses its hold on both the conscious and the subconscious levels. And then it stops being an obstacle in our sadhana. And instead, it can be used to ascend higher and higher to greater and greater heights. So this is why Chinnamasta actually, she is standing over Kamadeva and Rati, whose combined force is irresistible, but it can be resisted and it can be overcome. It can be conquered, so to speak, when we have Chinnamasta's grace. So, um, when we were talking about Sundari, we talked about Kamadeva and how he is burnt to ashes because of Shiva's anger, and then out of compassion for Rati, Parvati actually asks Shiva to bring him back to life, and then he comes back eventually as Bhandasura, and then it is destroyed by Lalita, and becomes and incorporated into her as her arrows. So without Kamadeva's arrows, we would not be interested in the desires that propagate the I self. So these, without his arrows, there would be no juice in life. And without Rati's enjoyment, we wouldn't have the desire to even get out of bed in the morning. So this procreative impulse is actually much more than the sexual act itself. It is the one that drives the desires from moment to moment. And so their union, between Kamadeva and Rati, beneath Chinnamasta's feet, actually shows us the concealing power of desire, which is necessary to sustain the cosmos and the I self. So we that desire is needed for this separation that the divine induces to for us to forget our true nature. So when we talk about Chinnamasta's shadow, it is addiction. So how how does this make sense? So let's talk about this. So when we think of addiction, we usually think of drugs or alcohol or smoking, as I was talking about, or gambling or pornography or whatever it may be. But the strongest addiction, the most acceptable addiction we can have, is the identification with the I self. So, because all 7 billion of us are addicted to the I self. So, in this forgetfulness that is induced by Chinnamasta's beheading, we mistake ourselves to be this story, this body mind, and this entraps us in this perpetual sense of lack, and leads to this never ending seeking of fulfillment. And so we are addicted to seeking fulfillment or this completion. And we keep chasing this or that, and we are addicted to the chasing itself, right? So that is Chinnamasta's big shadow. And so that these desires that arise from our vasanas, they pass through, because we haven't awakened the Sushumna yet. These desires actually pass through the Ida and the Pingala, and they give rise to attachment and aversion, because remember, their nature is dualistic. So it's one or the other all the time. And so this energy moving through the Ida and Pingala all the time is the basis for Chinnamasta's shadow of addiction. So our attachments and our aversions actually form the lens through which we see the world. They become the basis for what we attract into our lives. And what we actually do with our lives is based upon this lens that we wear, which is entirely colored by Varnini and Dakini, Chinnamasta's attendants, or the Ida and Pingala. And we become really addicted to one way of thinking, on one way of looking at the world. And it leads us to suffering and pain, but that doesn't matter. Even when there's suffering and pain, we are addicted to that, right? So when something happens to us, something bad happens to somebody, it kind of validates us. So this is where we need to examine all the other shadows of the previous Mahavidyas and how they come into play in Chinnamasta's big shadow of addiction. Because remember, it's that separation, the I self, is what keeps this Kali's shadow of aggression going. And then we are constantly justifying and validating our sense of this being separate, which is the I self, which is Tara's shadow. And of course, we have all these confusing desires, because they are constantly going through the Ida and Pingala, which are Sundari's shadow. And then we feel constricted because you can never expand when you have these dualistic tendencies, and that is Bhuvaneshwari's shadow. And then, of course, we are stuck in this inertia because of this addiction. right? We can't get out of this because all the other shadows are keeping us bound. So, in a very, twisted way, we become addicted to suffering. And do you know people like that who are addicted to suffering? Um, because the suffering actually validates us. It makes us feel kind of yummy, even though we're feeling terrible at the same time. And so when we view the world as being, terrible, it's out to get me, it's out to get everybody, and everything is terrible right now, then our when we view the world like that, our outlook is naturally based in suspicion, in fear, in the sense of separation, which leads to the self protection. So, this addiction to suffering is what keeps us hooked to this temporary feeling of being right. Right? So, this is why people who are suffering band together so that they can validate each other and they can validate themselves in these groups that are, talking about political divisiveness or whatever it might be. So, when we have this worldview of suffering, we attract situations and people that validate and magnify it and then continue to propagate those vasanas. So this is really how misery begets misery, as they say. So so Chinnamasta actually personifies the subtle movement between desire or will and knowledge. So will, as we know, is the fuel for knowledge and action, because it brings that wanting to know, that wanting to act, wanting to do something. And when desire leads to a specific conclusion in our mind, then that is knowledge, right? So you have a desire to know something, and then we arrive at a conclusion that becomes the knowledge for how we are going to behave going forward. So most of the time, the conclusion that we draw arises from our previous conditioning. So this is extremely important for us to see this. This is where, self enquiry becomes extremely important and also extremely difficult, because we think we are gaining new knowledge, and we fail to see that actually this kind of conclusion that we come to is based on our own previous, that lens I was talking about earlier, that lens that is colored by Varnini and Dakini. So our attachments and aversions are the ones that make us desire certain things and arrive at certain conclusions. So, and these conclusions that we come to, they validate those attachments and aversions. So you see, it's like a vicious cycle that keeps the I self very hale and hearty. So this kind of false knowledge, which is fed by attachment and aversion, is a way of cutting ourselves off from the divine. And when we jump to the same conclusions like this every time, it is because of Chinnamasta's shadow of addiction. And she, remember, personifies lightning and thunder. And as lightning, she is the supreme accomplisher of divine will. And she's the one who catalyzes divine will into knowledge and action. And so, this is how she acts through our minds as the power of perception behind the sense organs. So, our eyes and our sense organs basically are externally directed, right? And through them, we are taking in the world. And when we are addicted to the I self's attachments and aversions and those kinds of dualistic things, our sense organs become our tools through which we can fulfill our sense of lack. And so we approach those sense objects wanting them to complete us, right? So but that is always temporary. And as we have seen before, it really doesn't matter, how we are trying to indulge our senses, whether it's in material things or spiritual things. It really doesn't matter. It's still based in those attachments and aversions. And And amongst all of these sense organs, as I was saying before, the sexual impulse that drives the sense organs is the strongest. It has the strongest pull on the sense organs. It's capable of sparking, as you know. um, it can spark wars, and it can spark oppression, and kingdoms are lost and kingdoms are won based on this sexual impulse. And it is also the one that makes um, us want to control or dominate or possess somebody else, and which is what we see in a lot of relationships, um, where there is jealousy and possessiveness and so on. So, f- this issue of the sexual impulse in every spiritual tradition is is something that is feared, you know, because of its power, and because of the violence that it can invoke. And this this kind of shadow actually plays out in a lot of world traditions in very, very, very repulsive ways, right? So for instance, the whole Catholic Church and the abuse of children, um, because we have this idea that a spiritual person should not have sexual urges, and instead of working through it, those urges are suppressed or repressed, and they come out in all kinds of terrible ways. And so that was just one example, but you see that in a lot of other spiritual circles as well, where teachers abuse students, and so on. So all of that, remember, is Chinnamasta's great shadow, and that comes from this addiction, and that addiction being driven by this greatest impulse, which is the sexual impulse. So now, it doesn't matter whether this sexual impulse is procreative or it's perverted, right? As I said before, it is difficult to conquer even after prolonged sadhana, as any honest sadhaka or spiritual practitioner will tell you. It is difficult to conquer. Okay, so it is easy to suppress, but that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about conquering it, which is very different from suppressing it or hiding it away. So even great sages succumb to it, as we have seen. So there is this great story in the Puranas that talks about this, and that is the story of the great sage Vishwamitra. So Vishwamitra, as some of you may know, is said to be the seer of the Gayatri mantra. And Vishwa Mitra literally means, Vishwa is world, Mitra means friend. So he's the friend of the world. He's one of the 7 great sages said to be immortal. But he wasn't always like that. He was actually born a king. And so once this great king and his several of his several of his attendants, they are out hunting in the forest, and they get tired, and they're really far away from their kingdom, and they come across this little ashram in the woods, and they approach that ashram to see if they can get some rest and shelter and so on. And it happens to be the ashram of this great sage Vashishta. So this sage Vashishta comes out, and he welcomes Vishwamitra and his party, and says, please come, I'll have food ready for you, just go wash up in the river close by. So they go away, and they're making fun, and they're thinking, well, we're going to come back to roots and fruit, and something meager. But when they come back to the ashram, actually they are shocked to see that there is this huge tent set up with this amazing feast, and laid out for the king, basically. And so Vishwamitra is really puzzled. He goes to Vashishta and says, um, how did this happen? How did you make this happen? And so Vashishta says, he's very kind, and he takes Vishwamitra to the back of his ashram, and he shows him this beautiful sacred cow called Kamadenu, or Surabhi. He says, she gives anything I ask for. So Vishwamitra, you know being a king, he says, well, in that case, I need to have that cow. And so Vashishta says, nothing doing. She belongs to me, and nobody can take her from me. So Vishwamitra goes to war against Vashishta, and Vashishta, through the powers he has developed through his own sadhana, defeats the king and his army single-handedly. So Vishwamitra now gets really interested, and he says, whatever you have, I want that. So Vashishta takes, pity on him, and out of his great compassion, he actually teaches him. He gives him the sadhana and says, go practice this. For how many years? Remember what I said in the beginning of the class? For a few thousand years. So Vishwamitra leaves his kingdom and goes away to the Himalayas, and he meditates for thousands of years, comes down, and Vashishta says, wonderful, now you are a Raja Rishi. The Raja Rishi, Raja means king, Rishi is sage. You're a, kingly sage. And Vishwamitra is disappointed. He says, no, I want to be Brahma Rishi like you, the highest of the sages. So Vashishta says, well, go back and do more sadhana for a few more thousands of years. So Vishwamitra goes again, and this time he is in intense sadhana. Nobody can shake him. He just is lost in it, right? For thousands of years, he hasn't come out of meditation. Indra, the god of the heavens, as we've been talking about, gets really worried because now the whole of creation is getting heated. It's through his tapas, through Vishwamitra's tapas, which is Bhairavi's heat. And so Indra sends down the most beautiful of the apsaras that he has. Apsaras are these, heavenly, beautiful women. The most beautiful of them is Menaka, and he sends her to distract Vishwamitra. So she comes down to where he is, and she's trying to distract him for a very long time. And Vishwamitra keeps resisting her for a very long time. And eventually, his own hidden, suppressed sexual urge basically comes up. He opens his eyes, and he just forgets all about his sadhana. And he just, you know, uh, he gives into Menaka's advances, and they live like that for several years. And then she becomes pregnant with his child. And at that point, Vishwamitra suddenly realizes, oh my gosh, what just happened here? I've lost all my powers from my sadhana. So now he has to go back to zero and start again. So he sends Menaka away and says, I never want to see you again. And don't worry about Menaka, she does well. So Vishwamitra goes back to his sadhana and eventually becomes Brahma Rishi. But this is what we need to understand from the story. If the great Vishwamitra can give into it, we certainly can. We are just ordinary mortals compared to him, right? So we succumb to it as well, because that is the Maya, that is the power of this great goddess of Chinnamasta. So when we have Chinnamasta's grace, then what happens is our focus shifts. Like I was talking about, the Kundalini becomes active when our entire attention turns towards self-realization or liberation from the I self. And we start having different kinds of desires, for service or knowledge or devotion or whatnot. At that point, the Kundalini, this great sexual urge, is transformed into Chinnamasta's light of celibacy. So in the Yoga Sutras, Brahmacharya is the word that is used for this. And it's commonly translated as celibacy. And it is actually considered to be one of the prerequisites for advancement in yoga. But usually we think of celibacy as abstinence from sexual activity. And as I have been saying, and I'm sure, this is something that all of us uh, have seen and have heard about, that when we try to abstain from sexual activity without having cultivated that power for higher purposes, then that becomes repressed sexual energy. And it causes great imbalances in the body mind and takes us further away from liberation into the I self. But when we use it responsibly and with specific intentions, then it propels our awakening. So, brahmacharya is actually not abstinence. It is better understood as cultivating that energy that leads to the realization of Brahman. So, brahmacharya means it arises from this word Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. So, the acharya, or the kinds of behaviors that we have to cultivate to realize Brahman is brahmacharya. And so this emphasizes actually responsible cultivation of sexual energy. And the the whole issue of how to do that really rests on the first of the four universal desires we talked about, which is dharma, or living our lives according to our specific purpose, right? So now the the whole issue of dharma is actually tricky, because we need to understand what our purpose is based on our stage of life. So in the Vedic times, there used to be this system, um, this societal system known as ashrama, that really helped people understand what phase of life they were in. So there are four ashramas, or four stages of life. So the first one is called brahmacharya, which is the same word as the light that we're talking about. So brahmacharya is that phase of life that we are in as children. That whole period where we are focusing on education, on learning. So when we are children, our sole obligation, our sole duty, our sole dharma is to learn. That's it. And so here, abstinence is preferable because we want to avoid distractions. Not only that, but a certain amount of emotional maturity is required in order to handle sexual relationships. So, this is why during the phase of learning, celibacy or abstinence is required. It is a requirement in brahmacharya. Then the second stage of life is grihastha, which is the householder phase. So this is when we have finished our schooling and we enter the workforce and we become financially independent. And this is the time that we need to establish relationships. We procreate, we raise children, we pursue all our desires, we accumulate wealth and knowledge and fame and whatnot. And here, in the context of this family life, then we explore our sexual energy. And responsible sexuality is an important part at this time. Actually, in those times, it was not allowed for grihasthas to be abstinent. So there was a reason for that, because when you are a grihastha, you want to explore all of these desires and you want to be done with it. Because the next stage is called vanaprastha. And this is that stage of retirement. Now our children have left home, we start retiring from work. And then, this is a time, if we have been following this Vedic, way of living, then we are constantly assessing our desires and constantly inquiring into our desires. And then we fulfill any remaining sexual desires if they're appropriate within, again, this context of the householder life. So this is a great time in Vanaprastha to start contemplating on reality, on the higher knowledge, self knowledge. And then the final stage is sannyasa. So this final stage is basically one of solitude. So this is when, the husband and wife or the partners, basically they can live together, but they are not really together, and they are in solitude, and they are completely focusing on this process of liberation. So so there is that ashrama system. Now there is another system that also consists of um, four kinds of groupings. So in the Bhagavad Gita, in the fourth chapter, so the fourth chapter is actually a very important chapter. That's the whole, the third chapter is Karma Yoga, and the fourth is a Karma Sannyasa Yoga. And this is what we'll be focusing on in the retreat. But in the fourth chapter, there is this beautiful, famous verse. And it says, Lord Krishna is saying, Chaturvarnyam maya shrushtam gunakarma vibhagashaha tasya kartaram apimam vidya kartaram avyayam. Which means, he's saying, according to the gunas, the three, qualities, the three primordial qualities of existence, and the work associated with those, the four divisions of human society have been created. By who? By me. I am the one that has created that. And although I am the creator of this system, I am not the one that does anything. So I remain out of it. The gunas come from Prakriti, or, here we are talking about nature, the three gunas of nature. And these three gunas actually determine the kind of work each of us is supposed to be doing based on our particular combination of gunas. So so these, I like to look at them as the four types of callings in life. So unfortunately, in the Indian system, this has become denigrated as the caste system. But I don't really care for that, because it is completely taken out of context from the Bhagavad Gita and other texts, and really misused by those that think they are in the higher class so that they can oppress the ones in the lower classes. But actually, that isn't the case at all. It is extremely logical. So think about this. If I have a guna combination that begins with sattva. So I have the predominant guna is sattva. Then there's rajas, then there is tamas. So sattva, rajas, tamas in that order. Then that combination of gunas gives rise to a class of people known as Brahmins. Not Brahman, not Brahma, Brahmin. And so who are these people? These are the people that are thought leaders. They come up with ideas, and they are the scientists and the discoverers and the inventors and the philosophers, and those that have this original thought, right? The researchers. If you have a combination of rajas first, then sattva, and then tamas, then this grouping is called kshatriya. So these people are leaders, right? They are the politicians. They are the people in the military, they that take command. And in a corporation, they are the CEOs. They are the ones that know how to lead, right? So if I have a combination of rajas, then tamas, and then sattva. So rajas is the predominant, and the next is tamas, and then sattva. Then people with this kind of a guna combination are called vaishyas. Why? Because they excel at moving resources for a project. So, these are the people that can raise money. They can raise funds. They are the fundraisers. They are they can really think through. They have this talent of thinking through the economy and the organization. They are very good at details. They are the financial planners and the merchants and so on. And finally, if I have a combination of tamas first, then rajas, and then sattva, then I will belong to the class known as shudras. So the shudras are the ones that actually take the ideas and the concepts that have been created by the other classes, and they actually have this talent of turning the idea into a product, because they are the tradesmen. They are the programmers, um, the um, people that can produce out of a subtle idea. They're able to actually produce physical objects. So they have this immense talent for doing that. So you can see how um, our guna combination actually propels us to pick a certain kind of work. And that is possible only if we are in touch with our gunas and we actually know what we want rather than what we think we want based on society and so on, and culture and so on. So if we have the ashramas, we have the gunas, then we understand where we stand in terms of dharma, right? So if I am, for instance, a grihastha and I am uh, a kshatriya, right? So if I am the CEO of a corporation, or I am the leader of a project, then my dharma is to lead that project. My purpose is to lead that project. But at the same time, I happen to be a householder, so I need to provide for my children and for my family. That is all my dharma is. What somebody else is doing, how somebody else is making more money, how somebody else is, you know, sitting in a different office and doing something else is not my concern, because my dharma is what I need to be following. If I follow somebody else's dharma, then that becomes adharma for me. If somebody else follows in my footsteps instead of following their own dharma, then it's adharma for them, including our own children. So, um, this dharma is very unique to each of us, right? So, and then we have, of course, the four universal desires that we need to keep in mind as we go about our lives, right? So, always it needs to be in the framework of dharma, which is based on the ashramas and the gunas. And then we fulfill our, desire for worldly things or wealth and so on, artha, kama, which is sensual pleasures, again, as I just described, within the context of dharma, and then moksha or liberation, again, within the context of dharma. So, for instance, we may think, well, Siddhartha, the prince Siddhartha, left his wife and his family and went away to become the Buddha. But that's not the path for me. That's not my dharma. You see, that was his dharma. I can't leave my family and go away in search in the Himalayas, because that would be adharma for me. So what is dharma for one person is not dharma for the other person. So you see, in this understanding, we come out of Kali's shadow of violence as well, or aggression, because we simply don't have the ability to judge anyone and what dharma they are following. Because my attention should always be on my own dharma, right? So that is the purpose of me having here this four-pillared little mantap here, because these four pillars represent the four universal desires, they represent the four ashramas, and they represent the four varnas, the four groupings based on gunas. And you can see there is a little peacock feather there behind the Devi, who is Chinnamasta, because she sits right in the middle of this four-pillared mantap. But because this dharma is such an important part of the Bhagavad Gita, I have one of Krishna's peacock's feathers there. So, so we have to navigate our dharma through our will, knowledge, and action cycles that come up from one moment to the next moment. So at any given point, our dharma should be what we are supposed to be doing, as we discussed in the last class. Our dharma is to do what we are supposed to do and not do what we are not supposed to do. This is what I tell my children, for instance. At all times, if you keep your focus on what you're supposed to do, you will have a very low chance of straying from your dharma. And for that, to really understand what you're supposed to do, it takes this constant self-reflection, self-enquiry, and coming back to self-abidance, standing as the self again and again and again. So we become loosened from the grip of the I self. So what we don't want to do is to confuse our attachments and aversions for dharma. So for instance, if we think, well, I don't like my job, I want to do something else because, I hate this job and I like the other job. That is not necessarily dharma, because that comes from conditioning, the attachments and the aversions. So that clarity needs to be developed through this constant contemplation, through meditation, through these practices again and again, to understand what part of us is being pulled by attachments and aversions and what is really coming from the voice of dharma. So and as long as we don't give in to our attachments and aversions, then that creative energy, that procreative energy, can actually start doing some good work. Instead of being distributed between the Ida and Pingala, Chinnamasta's attendants, it can actually start to go up the Sushumna and start unraveling those granthis. So, and at that point, when we are able to allow this energy to come up the Sushumna, that's when our dharma becomes fueled by sexual energy. Now think about that for a second. So the way in which we cultivate our sexual energy determines our gunas. So this in turn determines our dharma, right? So how we cultivate our sexual energy, is it going to be in a way that you're allowing it to fuel your dharma, or are you allowing it to go towards your attachments and aversions, your likes and dislikes? That is going to determine what's going to come out of that, which are you cultivating sattva, or are you cultivating tamas or rajas? And that in turn is going to determine our dharma, right, as we saw earlier. So when we can set aside our likes and dislikes and instead direct this energy to what we need to do at any given moment, that's when, Bhairavi's shadow of inertia gives way to the enthusiasm of rajas. So you can never go from tamas directly to sattva. You have to go from tamas to rajas to sattva. So you have to let go of the inertia and cultivate this enthusiasm and this liveliness, which is rajas. And rajas actually enables us to discern between this, what I was talking about earlier, whether our desire is coming from our vasanas, or is it coming from our dharma? So, and then when we keep serving our dharma, when we keep standing in our purpose, in our dharma again and again and again, that's when rajas gives rise to sattva. It becomes sattva. So it so happens that when we cultivate sattva, it doesn't matter what we are doing, the way we start doing that changes. And you'll notice this actually in your own life. We may think that, I don't like my job, but actually, the more sattva we cultivate, that liking or disliking actually matters less, because we start enjoying what we are doing, because we are now letting go of these past kinds of likes and dislikes, and we are trying to abide in the eternal now. So, Chinnamasta is literally the striking power of the divine, right? So, Kali is very fierce, as we saw, and she's called Chandi. But Chinnamasta is actually more fierce and more terrible than Kali, and she's called Prachanda Chandi. So Kali is the power of transformation. So remember, she works along her timeline. But Chinnamasta's action is actually very swift and very instantaneous. So Kali is the prana Shakti. She is the Shakti, the prana that's in us. But Chinnamasta is the electrical energy, the sexual energy, which is the Vidyut Shakti. So Kali is said to live at the base of the spine, but Chinnamasta actually lives here in the center of the head. And it's the dispassion and discernment that we cultivate that directs our sexual energy from the Ida and Pingala into the Sushumna. So as this energy moves upwards, then these granthis that sustain the I self actually starts unraveling. They start to loosen, and the energy starts moving upward. And once it goes up, right? Once this energy goes up, then there is a second beheading, because when that energy reaches the Sahasrara chakra, the crown chakra, then the I self dies, because now this is the beheading of the I self to come back to realizing our divine nature, and realizing that at all times, even when we were lost in the story of the self, the I self, we were still divine. So there is the initial beheading that happens with the concealment, and then the second beheading happens with being revealed, this truth being revealed to us. And both of these are the powers of Chinnamasta. So, what I would suggest that we do is practice both the moving from the shadow to light, as well as the non-dual inquiries from the book. And the moving from the shadow to light exercises are pretty intense if done right. So make sure you spend some time doing those from the book. And the non dual inquiry is something that really will make a lot more sense once once we kind of become accustomed to this heart opener exercise. So when we stand as awareness, we see that all the thoughts and all the kinds of experiences arise and they subside. So when you stand as this awareness again and again, you'll notice that the sense of I that comes up is actually an arising in awareness, this global unlimited awareness that is who we really are. And this sense of separation is something that needs to be looked at again and again and again, through repeated inquiry into that particular um, uh, into that particular very tight knot that we can have around the sense of self or being attached to it. So that's what I would recommend that we do with this class. And I will stop here and take any questions. Shri Matre Namaha.